At 63, Demi Moore finally chose to speak honestly about Rob Reiner, and what she shared wasn't scandal, shock, or hidden conflict, but something far more revealing. For years, their connection remained quietly misunderstood, reduced to brief mentions tied to iconic films and passing interviews. Yet behind the scenes, their professional bond carried emotional weight that most audiences never noticed. In Hollywood, silence often creates its own narrative. When actors avoid talking about certain collaborators, people assume tension, fallout, or buried resentment. Demi Moore's silence about Rob Reiner fueled exactly that kind of speculation. Fans questioned what really happened after their work together, why she rarely addressed him publicly, and whether there was a deeper story left untold. Now, with decades of distance and clarity, Demi's words finally put those assumptions to rest. What she acknowledged wasn't controversy. It was respect, growth, and the complicated truth of working in an industry where intense creative relationships don't always fit into simple headlines. She reflected on how Rob Reiner challenged her, supported her, and pushed her during pivotal moments of her career. Even when the process wasn't easy, this wasn't a dramatic expose. It was something more rare, honesty without bitterness. And that's exactly why her words matter now. Because sometimes the real truth isn't loud, emotional, or explosive. It's the quiet clarity that only comes after time, reflection, and the courage to finally speak without fear of being misunderstood. Long before rumors ever surrounded their names, Demi Moore and Rob Reiner shared a professional relationship built on trust, discipline, and creative pressure. Their most well-known collaboration placed Demi in a demanding environment, one where expectations were high and mistakes were not easily forgiven. Reiner, already respected as a director who pushed actors to their limits, treated Demi not as a celebrity, but as a serious performer capable of more than the public often gave her credit for at the time. For Demi, this period came at a turning point in her career. She was transitioning away from roles that defined her early image and into performances that required emotional restraint, intellectual depth, and quiet strength. Working under Rob Reiner's direction meant stripping away habits, confronting insecurity, and accepting criticism that wasn't always gentle. She later acknowledged that it wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. What many fans don't realize is that Reiner's approach wasn't about control, but preparation. He was known for rehearsing scenes repeatedly, dissecting dialogue, and demanding authenticity, even when cameras weren't rolling. Demi found this challenging, especially in an industry where actresses were often guided rather than challenged. Instead of being told what would look good, she was asked what felt true, a question that forced growth rather than performance. Over time, this process reshaped how Demi viewed her craft. She began to see acting less as presentation and more as responsibility. Responsibility to the story, to the audience, and to herself. Reiner's influence didn't end when filming wrapped. The discipline and confidence she developed during that collaboration quietly followed her into later projects. Even when his name was no longer attached, despite this impact, Demi rarely spoke about Rob Reiner publicly for years. Not because of conflict, but because their work together didn't fit neatly into Hollywood narratives. There was no dramatic fallout, no feud, no headline-friendly tension. Instead, there was mutual respect mixed with creative intensity, the kind of relationship that doesn't lend itself to soundbites. In later interviews, Demi reflected on how some of the most meaningful professional relationships are the hardest to explain. They aren't warm friendships or bitter rivalries. They exist in a gray space where growth comes from discomfort, honesty comes from friction, and respect is earned rather than declared. Her connection with Reiner fell squarely into that category. What's striking is how differently she speaks about that time now. At 63, her tone is calm, reflective, and grounded. There's no defensiveness, no need to rewrite the past. She openly credits Reiner for pushing her when she needed it most, even if she didn't fully understand it at the time. That clarity, she admits, only came years later, after distance replaced pressure. She also acknowledged that Hollywood often misinterprets silence. When actors don't revisit certain collaborations publicly, audiences assume unresolved issues. In reality, some experiences are simply processed privately. Demi's choice to finally speak wasn't about correcting rumors, but about acknowledging influence, about giving credit where it was due, Without exaggeration or drama. This honesty matters because it reframes how success is understood. Not every pivotal moment comes with applause. Some arrive quietly, disguised as difficulty, leaving their mark long after the spotlight moves on. Rob Reiner's role in Demi Moore's journey fits that description, not a headline moment, but a foundational one. As Demi looks back now, she doesn't romanticize the past. She recognizes its challenges, respects its lessons, and accepts its complexity. And in doing so, she offers something rare in Hollywood storytelling: a mature, unfiltered acknowledgement that growth often comes from the people who challenge us most, even if we don't thank them until decades later. As Demi Moore's career evolved, the lessons she absorbed during her time working with Rob Reiner began surfacing in subtle but unmistakable ways. Her performances grew quieter, more controlled, and emotionally grounded. Where she once relied on intensity and visibility, she now leaned into restraint, a shift that many critics noticed, but few connected back to the influence of directors who had challenged her earlier. Reiner's insistence on truth over theatrics became part of her internal compass. Even when his name was no longer present in the conversation, Hollywood, however, rarely celebrates the slow, internal transformations of its stars. Instead, it thrives on visible conflict and dramatic narratives. Because Demi never publicly revisited her collaboration with Reiner in great detail, speculation filled the void. Some assumed distance meant disagreement. Others suggested creative tension had left unresolved feelings. None of those narratives were accurate, but they spread easily in an industry that treats silence as a statement. Demi later acknowledged that stepping away from public commentary was intentional. At certain points in her life, she was navigating personal struggles, family responsibilities, and the pressure of maintaining relevance in an unforgiving industry. Revisiting the past publicly felt unnecessary when she was still processing its meaning privately. Growth, she learned, doesn't always require explanation. As time passed, her perspective softened. Distance allowed her to separate the emotional weight of the experience from its value. What once felt demanding began to feel formative. She realized that Reiner had seen potential in her that she hadn't fully trusted yet. His expectations weren't about dominance or ego. They were about standards. And standards, she now recognizes, are often misunderstood when they're applied without comfort. In reflecting on that era, Demi also touched on how differently men and women experience creative pressure in Hollywood. When male actors are pushed, it's often framed as mentorship. When women are pushed, it's frequently labeled as harshness. That imbalance shaped how her collaboration with Reiner was perceived at the time, even though the treatment itself was equal. The misunderstanding wasn't personal, it was cultural. By speaking now, Demi reframed the narrative without attacking the past. She didn't deny the difficulty. She acknowledged it honestly. But she also refused to reduce the experience to discomfort alone. Instead, she emphasized what it produced: resilience, confidence, and a deeper understanding of her own capabilities. Those outcomes mattered more than temporary strain. What stands out most in her reflection is the absence of regret. Demi doesn't wish the experience had been easier. She doesn't suggest it should have been softened or altered. She understands now that growth often arrives through challenge, not reassurance. And that truth, she believes, applies beyond acting to life, relationships, and self-worth. Her decision to finally speak wasn't about settling a score or rewriting history. It was about offering clarity in an industry that rarely provides it. By choosing honesty over spectacle, she disrupted the expectation that every revelation must come with shock value. Sometimes, the real story is simply understanding. This moment also highlighted something rarely discussed in Hollywood: the long arc of respect. Some collaborations don't leave immediate warmth, but they leave lasting impact. Demi's words suggest that Rob Reiner's influence lived quietly within her work for years, shaping choices audiences never linked back to him. In the end, her reflection wasn't about Rob Reiner alone. It was about how time reshapes meaning. How experiences that once felt heavy can later feel essential. And how speaking the truth doesn't always mean revealing something new. Sometimes it means finally understanding something old. With time, Demi Moore also began to recognize how her experience working with Rob Reiner influenced the way she approached power, authority, and collaboration in Hollywood. Earlier in her career, she often felt the need to prove herself, to be seen, validated, and taken seriously in rooms where decisions were rarely made by women. Under Reiner's direction, she learned that respect wasn't something granted through approval, but something earned. More vocal and less willing to compromise her instincts for the sake of comfort. While audiences saw confidence on screen, what they didn't see was the internal shift that allowed her to trust her own judgment. The pressure she once resisted had quietly become a source of strength. Demi also reflected on how Hollywood narratives often simplify complex, professional relationships. People want heroes and villains, harmony or conflict. But real creative partnerships don't exist in those extremes. They live in contradiction. Moments of doubt paired with moments of breakthrough, frustration followed by respect. Her relationship with Reiner fit that reality, even if it didn't satisfy public curiosity. As years passed, the industry around her changed, but the lessons remained. Younger actors often came to Demi seeking advice, asking how she maintained longevity in a business that constantly replaces its stars. She found herself repeating principles she once learned the hard way. Take your work seriously. Accept discomfort as part of growth. And don't confuse criticism with rejection. She also acknowledged that speaking openly now felt different because she no longer needed approval. At 63, she wasn't trying to protect an image or control perception. She had lived long enough to understand that truth doesn't always land immediately, but it lasts. Her words about Rob Reiner weren't meant to reshape public opinion. They were meant to be accurate. What made this reflection especially powerful was its restraint. There were no dramatic revelations, no emotional outbursts, no attempt to reframe the past as something it wasn't. Instead, Demi allowed complexity to exist. She respected the difficulty without exaggerating it and honored the impact without overstating it. She also spoke about how memory changes with perspective. Moments that once felt overwhelming can later feel instructional. Distance doesn't erase emotion, it clarifies it. That clarity, she believes, is what finally allowed her to speak without defensiveness or hesitation. In doing so, she challenged a common Hollywood assumption that silence equals resentment. Sometimes silence is simply processing. Sometimes it's maturity. And sometimes it's choosing not to define an experience until you truly understand what it gave you. Demi's honesty also shed light on the unseen emotional labor of acting. Behind every performance is a series of private battles, fear, doubt, discipline, and vulnerability. Directors like Rob Reiner, who demand truth, don't always receive immediate gratitude. But their influence often shows up years later, in the way an actor carries themselves, chooses roles, and defines success. Her reflection wasn't nostalgic. It was grounded. She didn't speak as someone reliving the past, but as someone who had integrated it. And that integration, she suggested, is what allows growth to settle into wisdom. By the time she finished speaking about Rob Reiner, it was clear that the truth she finally told wasn't a secret waiting to be exposed. It was an understanding waiting to mature. One shaped by time, experience, and the courage to acknowledge that not all meaningful relationships feel good in the moment, but they matter deeply in the end. Looking back now, Demi Moore's decision to speak openly about Rob Reiner at 63 isn't just a reflection on one professional relationship. It's a broader lesson in perspective, patience, and gratitude. The intensity she experienced on set decades ago, which once felt like pressure or criticism, now reads as a formative experience that shaped her career in ways subtle yet profound. She no longer remembers only the challenge, she appreciates the lessons it left behind. Her reflection highlights an important truth about Hollywood. The most influential relationships aren't always glamorous or publicized. They don't always involve red carpets or awards shows. Often, they are quiet, private, and lived in the spaces between takes, in the guidance, feedback, and small corrections that shape an actor's instincts and choices. In Demi's case, Reiner's influence persisted long after cameras stopped rolling, leaving a lasting imprint on her craft, her confidence, and her understanding of her own professional voice. By finally speaking about it, Demi reframes the narrative. She doesn't seek attention or validation. She doesn't turn private struggles into spectacle. Instead, she honors the complexity of mentorship, collaboration, and personal growth. Her words convey that not all meaningful experiences in Hollywood are understood immediately. And not all truths are dramatic, sometimes. They are quietly powerful. There's also a subtle commentary here on maturity. In a culture obsessed with instant gratification, gossip, and viral headlines, Demi demonstrates that reflection with distance carries more weight than reaction in the moment. Speaking now, decades later, she can describe the influence of Rob Reiner with clarity, nuance, and honesty, without the need for embellishment or sensationalism. Finally, her story serves as a reminder for anyone observing her journey. Success and growth often come from challenges that don't make the front page. The discomfort she once felt on set, the intense scrutiny, and the high expectations were not obstacles to overcome but tools that forged resilience, self-awareness, and deeper skill. In acknowledging them, she honors both her own journey and the unseen role Reiner played in shaping it. In the end, Demi Moore's revelation isn't about controversy or secrets. It's about recognizing the quiet impact that formative relationships have, the lessons learned under pressure, and the value of time in understanding their significance. Her honesty at 63 demonstrates that sometimes the most profound truths are those we only see clearly after the years have passed. Truths that shape who we become, how we work, and how we view the people who helped guide us along the way. This reflection leaves audiences not with gossip, but with respect, perspective, and a reminder that in both life and art, the deepest influences often remain unseen until we're ready to truly understand them.